the deliverance of Israel from its foreign enemies. Complementarianism, on the other side, is a biblical worldview. It recognizes that God has separate and distinct responsibilities for men and women, and that allows for a balance to be able to support each other. So in the ideal situation, there's each individual, the husband and the wife, a man and a woman. Within the context of the church, men and women, they have particular roles. And those roles are defined in such a way and created in such a way so that they complement what men cannot do. Women have been made and created by God to be able to do. And those things that women cannot do or are not supposed to be doing, God has created men to be able to fill that gap. And so one complements the other. It started with the day of creation, with when God created Adam and then brought Eve out of Adam's rib. So from the beginning of time, from the creation story, we find that God had established a biblical model or a pattern of headship. I'm not so sure today in most churches that all of it has to do with egalitarianism or evangelical feminism or the lack of understanding of what complementarianism is. That is the role of each as it complements one another. But rather, we might say that part of the problem could be that of passivity, or the fact that men have forfeited their duties and their responsibilities over to that of women within the home and within the church. I'm not here to single anybody out, and I don't sit here and think, now, who could that possibly be? But however, when you look across the landscape of American families and the landscape and the terrain of the local church, you begin to see these things. And it raises the question, and I'm not the only one that raises the question, but it comes up, where are the men? Where are the men that God has assigned duties and responsibilities to be able to stand up and answer the call for leadership and headship both at home and in the church? You see, that's a very important question, because if we don't answer that and men don't take on that as a calling and as a duty, we'll enter into the same configuration that egalitarianism wants us to be in, except it's going to be more of passivity. It just doesn't work out that way. I don't have the same skills that my wife has, or she can do it, or we'll let the women of the church manage it. They're real go-getters. They have all the capabilities, the technology, and all those kind of things. We just turn it over to them. And there's a trend that is absolutely taking place. Where does this take us? Before we even get into the bulk of the sermon, we got to think, has this ever happened before? And the other side of it is it possible that this is a kind of judgment that God is bringing upon the church or a nation, whereby there is an absolute role reversal that is taking place? You see, egalitarianism isn't necessarily concerned about equality, but rather they're concerned about headship, leadership. Equality takes a second seat to, we want to be the ones that are going to run the show. That's the bottom line of the feminist movement and other movements for that matter. But when we talk about where will that bring a nation, where will that bring a church, you go to Isaiah chapter 3. In Isaiah chapter 3, that God warns the nation that part of the punishment that he is going to bring upon them is going to show itself to 2 to 3 different ways, and it's very clearly stated in the verse. In verse 4 it says, "And I will give children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them." In other words, it's going to be a case where people of experience, the people with the ability, very young at age, are going to become rulers. Now, Ecclesiastes, Solomon marks that down as something as an anomaly. It seems to be odd, he says, that when a young prince, when a child rules the throne, and the people kind of squirm about that. I'm really paraphrasing, but when you read it out of the book of Ecclesiastes, one of the problems that he sees in society is that problem when people that are too young for a public office begin to rule. They lack knowledge and experience and wisdom. And what God says he's going to do, he's going to bring that about on Israel. So looking at history as being linear, and considering the fact that history is written for us to acknowledge and learn from it, we would learn from Israel and their fall and their disobedience to God, that one of the ways in which he would bring about a punishment upon them would be the children to rule. And then in verse 5, the child shall behave himself proudly against the ancients, and the base against the honorable. We see much of that happening today. You old people in wheelchairs, what do you know? And you're having a hard time getting around. How can you think? You don't understand the times in which we live. And that kind of rhetoric that we oftentimes hear. A lot of disrespect for those people of wisdom and age, whereby not only is it wisdom of the scriptures, but it's wisdom of experience that teaches people things. And so there's a wholesale rejection of the wisdom of the older generation. This is what happened to Israel. And can be, and I think it is in part happening, even in the United States and in our local churches. Go down to verse 12. As for my people, children are their oppressors. Women women rule over them, O my people. So here again, you see what happens. The children begin to rule in public office. The young generation begins to have a total disrespect and a rejection of the wisdom of the older generation, and women begin to rule and take authority over church, home, and in politics. So if you're not sure if that's actually being promoted, one of the TV shows that is very popular is Madam Secretary, comes on Sunday night. That's no accident that this lady is running for president. And they copy so much that has already taken place. They build these scenarios off of historic events that have taken place in the government. But it is the projection of, here is the future of the United States. And so it's not that it's an absolutely bad thing, but what it's representing for us is that trend, that worldview that is unbiblical, whereby men in leadership are surrendering their role, women are taking over, and the worst case scenario is going to be what Isaiah prophesied for the people of Israel, as very well could take place in the United States today. So we have to go somewhere with this. We have to take into consideration some of those texts of scriptures that these writers on evangelical feminism and what appears to be what's wrong with. So what's wrong with a woman pastor? What's wrong with a wife that manages everything in the household, especially if the husband is in default mode? What's wrong with the kind of authority that we're seeing that is being taken over by the female population? What's wrong with that? Well, you go to the Old Testament and you can say, well, listen, we can find I can cite for you several passages where we actually see that. If you look at it from a very narrow view, you could probably pull that out. But if you go from a broad perspective, you would find that there was an Old Testament pattern that was established. There were patriarchs instead of matriarchs, and so the tribes were named after men and their family names. We would also find that the only legitimate mediators between God and people were the priest and not priestesses. The Old Testament doesn't even have the word. Do a word search, and in terms of as it was associated with Israel. There were priestesses in pagan cults. Even in the book of Ephesus, we would find that in the religion of Ephesus at that time. But when it came to what was happening with Israel, they didn't even go to that extent. However, we'd find that God would appoint kings and not queens. The key word there is appoint. He called men to be the focal point of his covenants with mankind. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and Jesus. So these are the appointments. And you'll notice that all of these are men. As we move forward, you get into the New Testament, we would also notice this. God appointed 12 disciples. He sent out in the book of Luke 70 men to go out into the different cities. Later on, as the church was formulated and the structure of the church was built, there would be elders and pastors, identified as being the husbands of one wife. And then there would be the office of deacon. That would be as it is for the eldership and the bishop position, which is a pastoral office. The office of the deacon would have to be qualified as men. There was an explicit command found in 2 Timothy for a woman not to teach or have authority over men. But you'll notice that it wasn't divided. There were not 12 apostles, of 12, whereby 6 were men and 6 were women. It wasn't 35 and 35 of the 70 that were sent out. Nor in any of these were any of these offices defined or established by such things as their skills or their credentials or their capability or their experience or even that of necessity. But rather, it was clearly stated that men would have these positions of headship, and there's a reason for that. And we have to understand that even though a woman may be more qualified to do a particular project or an office, she may have all the qualifications and all the credentials, what is lacking in God's patterns, the fact is that it's not a man. And so decisions are not made based upon what the system of society goes with today. And that is, what do you have in the background? What is decided first and foremost is the gender for the particular role and the operation, the office that is to be held. As we move forward, biblical leadership in the church and home, there are examples of female leadership in the Old Testament. The Bible doesn't hide these things. But when we take a close look at it, and each one of these will find that there is either a situation where there's a category, for example, in that of the queens, there was two very bad queens. Jezebel, all you had to do is be at church once or twice in a year, and you're probably going to hear Jezebel's name come up. She was a very wicked queen. And she put Pulse Bullington out and a warrant for the arrest of Elijah. She was just notorious for bloodshed. And she died in bloodshed. And then Athaliah was determined to erase all the seed of the Judean kings. And so she killed her own grandchildren. Just one by one would have them taken out. And it was by the bravery of one other grandmother that she would hide a particular child that was of the seed of Judah. And then later on, he would arise, become king. So that one grandmother, in a heroic effort, actually saved the Davidic seed from annihilation. Why did all that take place? Because of a wicked queen who took the office. But then when you go to the story of Esther, you find a different kind of scenario. She was absolutely a queen, and she was in a position of authority. When you read the story, she's right up in there with the king, and she's making requests that have to do with some very pertinent military and political agendas. Hers was no simple, just a little statue off to the side, the way many queens are today. She had a position of power and authority. But when you look at Esther's life, she also had an adopted father, which was her uncle Mordecai. And she would defer to Mordecai to find out what should we do in this scenario. And she would also defer to her husband. She was married to a pagan king. But nevertheless, she would submit herself to his authority. When she went into the king's court on that particular day, she went in with fear and trembling. Because unless the scepter had been lowered to allow for and introduce to come in, she very well could have lost her life, and she knew that. So when she counseled with her uncle Mordecai, and there was a little bit of trepidation there, what should I do? He is the one that would give her those infamous words, and that is this: you are here for such a time as this. And so she would enter into the king's court and make her request known. And in the end of that story, we would find that the Jews would celebrate a victory over their enemies. On this section of priestesses, like I said before, there was no mention of it at all. We go to prophetess, the female office of the prophetess. Yes, absolutely. God did establish those kind, but they were never in positions of teaching or in leadership. You'll find that their office is either mentioned without a description of what they do, or when they are mentioned as to their practice, you'll find them in a very private setting, such as what it is when we get to that of Deborah. But going back further than that, in the Old Testament, after the crossing of the Red Sea, Moses leads the congregation of all the people in a great song, a celebration of the victory in Jesus. We cross the Red Sea and we watch the enemies destroyed. Miriam, his sister, takes the women off to the side in verses 20 and 21 of chapter 15, and she writes her own song. But you'll notice she takes the women off to the side. She did not have a congregational meeting. It wasn't where all the people are invited, and she steps up there beside Moses. As a matter of fact, the one time that she did attempt, her and her brother Aaron, to be on par with Moses, she ended up with leprosy. But interestingly enough, Aaron did not. And that is when they came up to Moses and said, "Who are you that you should have all the authority? We're all the same family. Aaron and I believe that we should be on par, egalitarian with you." And the Lord smote Miriam with leprosy, but not Aaron. And the reason for that is because it demonstrates to us that attempt on her part to step out of her role and be equal to, in terms of authority, with Moses, who was God's chosen spokesman. And Aaron already knew his place, but he wasn't actually stepping out of it other than a lateral move, whereas Miriam was trying to rise up and become equal. It's just interesting. And in the end of the story, Moses interceded for her, and she was healed of her leprosy. But nevertheless, she still had to stay outside the camp for 7 days till the days of purification were accomplished. You look at Huldah in the 2 Kings, chapter 22. Josiah is a young king, and he had a godly grandparentage. He's a king that wanted to bring about a spiritual revival to Judah. And he discovered that the books of the law were hidden and not being read. And so when they're discovered, he sends an entourage of messengers to the prophetess, Huldah. And what does she do? When you read it in the text, you will find that she doesn't come back with them and then have a public reading to all of the people of Judah at that time, but rather she basically has all the men in her chamber and says, "This is what the word of the Lord says." A private meeting with just the messengers, and she sends them back to, "You tell the king this, thus saith the Lord." In other words, she operated within the confines and the position of her role, the limited authority and the place that she had. She didn't do anything that would demonstrate that she was going to rise to the top and be the prophet of the day. None of that would take place. Even Isaiah's wife was a prophetess, but you don't read anything about her role, her activity. So anything that she did would have been of a private work, just with those people in the immediate context. Anna in the book of Luke is mentioned as a prophetess, and then there were the 4 daughters of Philip in the New Testament, given to us in the book of Acts. So there was the role of a prophetess, but each one of these would work within the biblical structure. So they had their place, they had their capabilities, they were gifted individuals, gifted women of God. They served well in Israel, and in the case of Philip and his daughters in the local church. They did that which God had given to them, but nobody tried to step out of that boundary. They accepted that place or position where they were in. We look at their worldview, and they understood that God has given to us this place, this gift, and these abilities with limited movement under the authority, submitting to the male headship within the community. So where do we go from here? Well, when we take in consideration of what is happening in the world and the evangelical feminism, egalitarianism, how's that differ from complementarianism, you'll find this, that they often, making everything equal, leveling the playing field, defers to Esther and Deborah. So we want to spend our time in Deborah this morning, as the text that was read to us, and ask some questions. Why does Deborah serve as judge to begin with? How does she ever get into that position? And her position is often brought up as to support female leadership. Did she actually have a position of leadership? She raises an understandable confusion to the issue, no doubt about it, because when at first reading, you get the impression that she is the judge of Israel, and you find that she's telling Barak what to do, And she's also giving a voice for God. So she appears to be a woman that is in authority over the entire nation. And actually what we're going to learn that it demonstrates how she actually supports the principle of male headship. And there's some very valuable lessons that we can learn from her that help us as men, as women, in our homes and in the church, that are going to be useful as we go along. First thing we'd recognize is this, that in the book of Judges, in all of those years in which they were under suppression and going through times of suffering, when God would send a redeemer, you would read these words, and the Lord raised up a deliverer, Othniel, and the Lord raised up a deliverer, Ehud, and the Lord said to Gideon, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and Samson grew, and the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him. But when we get to this story, we do not find that language. We actually enter into the narrative in the middle of a time when the people of Israel are coming to Deborah because of her wisdom on civil matters, on judicial matters, society, and we basically were coming into the middle of the movie, and we end up at that tree of Deborah. And this is where the story picks up in her life. There's nothing about her before that, and when you read the scriptures, you'll never see her name mentioned again. You'll see Barak's name. He's mentioned in 2 Samuel as along with another man who as one of the deliverers. And then you'll find his name mentioned in the Hall of Fame in the Heroes of Faith in Hebrews chapter 11. But not Deborah. And what does that teach us? It just teaches her role was not that of leadership. She understood her role, and she's going to complement, she's going to be a helpmeet to Barak. She was a prophetess, and she was doing her duty in the context of what was allowable for her to do, but she would never step out of those boundaries. So there's several things that we can learn. The first is going to be this, that the whole story implies a rebuke against the absence of male leadership. When we get to verse 4 of chapter 4, when we get to verse 4 of our chapter, it says, and Deborah a prophetess, the wife of Labadoth, she does Israel at that time, and she dwelt under the palm tree. Now just that series of words. We have a female name, she's called a prophetess, and the wife. Now why did the writer go out of his way to describe who we have here? When you read it, you get a sense that something's not right. Especially when you look at all the other introductions of a deliverer that is coming on. And the Lord spoke to this individual and this man and this king. But we don't see that here. But rather we see stacked up feminist terms to describe to us that something is amiss within the nation. And what is amiss is the fact there were no men that would listen to the call of God and rise up to the occasion. Barak was a general. He had the army. But rather than calling upon the Lord and knowing what the sequence of events have been in the past judges prior to him, he's kind of like just out there. And Deborah isn't necessarily going to step in and say, well, if you're not going to do it, then I'm going to do it for you. We find Deborah, and she dwelt under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel at Mount Ephraim, and the children of Israel came up to her for judgment. So she's not going out seeking a political office. She's not advertising her skills and ability. She's not out in the public square making grand announcements or explaining what's going south on the part of Israel and Judah. She's not doing any of that. She's there, and we find that the people are coming to her. And the word that is used for judge there is not the same word as a place of office. but rather it's a Hebrew word that simply means the one that's giving counsel, the one that's giving direction, which further demonstrates that all she was doing was that ability that she had, and the helping people on civil matters. Decisions had to be made. And so this is where we find her. But in this, what does it say about the men? Where are they? They're not there. They're not to be found. And so there's this implied rebuke in the absence of male leadership. Secondly, she did not rule, but she was just making decisions on basic controversies. That is the operation of this judging Israel during that time. And then what we would also learn from this is that she affirmed the male leadership. So the bulk of the story is when she calls and sent and called Barak, the son of Obed-Edom, out of Kadesh Naphtali, and said unto him, hath not the Lord of God of Israel commanded, saying? So as a prophetess, she received word from God. Probably went something like this: that General Barak, go get him. I have words for him. And you are the one that is going to break the news. You're going to tell him what's next. Maybe also as an aside, because he's not listening to me. All the other kings, all the other generals, we would read that, and God called, or God appointed, and God raised up. Even Gideon, who was the smallest of all the tribes of Israel, just simply farming, and the God would visit him. Gideon wasn't even sure if he was supposed to do the task. That's why you have the wet fleece, dry fleece, just to make sure. But not with Barak. Whatever his issue was, spiritual condition, we're not sure. But Deborah simply does this. She affirms the male leadership. She obeys God's word. She calls him in and tells him what's going to take place. Go and draw to Mount Tabor and take with thee 10,000 men. Now we have to take into consideration what's happening here. This is no small challenge. If you remember in verse 3, and the children of Israel cried unto the Lord, for this man of Hazad had 900 chariots of iron and 20 years of experience in keeping Israel suppressed. Now, 900 chariots of iron is a sizable army. That's just the chariots. That's not talking about the foot soldiers. And so the challenge that he is given is a big call. It is a faith call. And she comes to him and says, you go and draw to Mount Tabor. You take with you the 10,000 men and Naphtali and the children of Zebulun. And I will draw unto thee over the river Kishon Sisera, the captain of Jacob's army, and his chariots, and his multitude, and I will deliver him into your hand. The words of the prophetess. And Barak said unto her, if you will go with me, then I will go, but if thou wilt not go with me, then I will not go. And she said, I will surely go with thee, but the honor is not going to be yours. She would never take his place. She affirmed his leadership, and when she had the opportunity to actually say, I'll go and I'll lead, she didn't do that. She was just going to go along with. And we find that the whole event is between Barak and the enemy. And in the end, we hear Deborah writing a hymn of praise and celebration. She worships the Lord. So it's noteworthy that in this episode, she affirms the headship. We glean that much from her. And Barak was a man that was timid. But yet at the same time, we give him credit because he did take heed to the words of the prophetess. He didn't get off on an ego trip. He didn't say anything like, there ain't no woman going to tell me what to do. I'll figure this out on my own. He understood what was being said. He understood that there was authority behind those words. He also understood he was supposed to be the one that was supposed to take the lead. But because of his being a timid individual, probably more fearful than anything, he would have to surrender and ask this woman of faith to come in and go with him on this journey into battle. Well, you know the rest of the story. Deborah would said, and you'll not get the glory for it because it's actually going to be a woman that is going to take out Sisera. And that bloody, more power to her woman that drives a tent stake into the man's head while he's sleeping from exhaustion is quite an event to be able to do that. But at the same time, it doesn't speak much for the general himself that was supposed to be the kind of individual to be able to do this. So as we exit from that and we get to the takeaway, what can we learn from this and take home with us today? I think there are two things. For the men, we got to learn to honor the scriptures. We have to be active leaders in our home and in our church. We have to be the ones that raise the questions. We have to be the ones that come up with the ideas. We have to do that which call of duty to lead and direct and to think and to reason and to prepare. Not become passive and not let others do it, but to take that position that God has given to us and own it. Own our headship that God has provided. We look on the side of the women, we look at Deborah, and we find that she honored the scriptures. She affirmed male leadership. She wasn't going to take his place. Even though she probably could have, she didn't. She allowed Barak to do what he was going to do within his capabilities, and she would stand down because she was a woman of faith. She understood that her role, and she wouldn't go beyond her role, but yet within it, within the context that God had put her, she would be the one to encourage him. She would give him that hope and give him that direction. She would encourage, but she would never take over and lead. So she would encourage. She deferred to Barak as the general of the army. And I put a third word down there for defend. And that's more in terms of defending male leadership and headship in our society today. For women to be able to stand firm and true to say, this is the way, the biblical model that God has given to us. This has been the pattern throughout history. And if you want to understand why things are not so good in your society today, then all you have to do is look around. Once you enter into that idea of egalitarianism and everything being equal, you just look at all the byproduct that comes out of that. And you can understand that the way that God established it at first, even though they may not agree with it, we still have to be in a position that we're going to defend what God has put in place for us, the patterns established from creation and onward. So as women, we encourage, we defer, we defend. Men, it's just very simple. Honor the scriptures, be the leader, and own that headship that God has given to us. God can bless our homes. God can bless our church. We have to think these things out individually within the context of every home and every church. And individualize and itemize, raising the question, how could I be a better leader? What should I do to give the impression, the perspective that God has placed me here and I'm making this happen? Or on the part of the women, what am I doing that maybe the men, maybe my husband has just given it up? Is it possible that we've put ourselves in that position, ladies? These are things that individual families, homes, the church, we have to look at carefully. Otherwise, we fall into the trap of evangelical feminism. We fall into the possibility of what Isaiah said would happen to those people, where there's a reversal of age, capability, and wisdom when it comes to leadership, that of what's going to happen when men just give up and after a while everything is being run and ruled by women. It's not that they wouldn't be able to do it. That's not the issue. The issue is that we stepped out of the boundary lines. We're no longer in the context of God's ordained plan and pattern. Once we modify the pattern and make our own pattern, there are a lot of unanswered questions. There are a lot of issues that are going to arise. So this isn't a matter of equality and capability and skills. That's not it at all. What it is a matter of whether or not whether or not we understand or not God's model for leadership. So, Father, we pray that as we take this, we take it home with us, we use it and put the whole concept to work. There's more detail to it than what is given to us here, but yet we've established a foundation. We see a model of a woman that had all of the potential, and she had the criteria, she had the possibility to be able to rule and to take over, but she did not. We also see an indictment against men in that day that would not stand up and answer the call, not hear the voice of God, and know how to defend their nation, defend their families, and challenge the enemy. Might that not be said about us here at our church and in our homes? In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.